All right, so we're diving into reconciliation action plans, or RAPs, as they're often called in Australia.
RAPs, yeah.
You sent a whole bunch of research and articles my way, and, well, it seems like you really want to get to the bottom of how these things work.
Yeah, I really want to understand the origins of the program
Yeah, where the idea came from, how it's changed over time.
and what impact it's actually had.
Exactly, the real impact. That's the key.
Yeah, and it's a very fascinating question.
Yeah.
To my knowledge, Australia is kind of unique in how they use RAPs to get organizations involved in reconciliation.
So to really grasp this whole RAP thing,
Right.
we need to go back a bit, historically speaking, right?
Yeah, let's rewind the tape a little.
Okay, so paint the picture for me.
Okay.
What's the historical backdrop for all of this?
Well, you could say the modern reconciliation movement in Australia really got going in 1991
Okay.
with the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation, CIR.
CAR. Okay, so was CAR formed to right the wrongs of the past, to address the injustices against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Their goal was to acknowledge all those injustices
Yeah.
and then try to chart a path towards a more equitable future.
So a lot of their work initially was about sparking national dialogue,
Yeah, a lot of education.
educating people, educating Australians about Indigenous history and about the concept of reconciliation itself.
Exactly.
And it makes me think of some of those big, iconic events,
Yeah.
like the Sydney Harbour Bridge Walk back in 2000.
Oh, yeah.
Hundreds of thousands of people marching for reconciliation.
Symbolic.
It felt like a turning point
It really did.
for the whole country.
Those events were incredibly powerful symbolically.
Yeah.
And they did a lot to gather public support.
Yeah.
But like any movement, you have this initial burst of energy.
Right.
And then the real challenge is keeping that momentum going.
Keeping that fire lit.
Exactly. And that's where Reconciliation Australia, RA, comes in.
So RA picked up the baton from CORAR.
Essentially, yeah.
Okay.
They emerged from CAR's work in the year 2000.
2000.
And they inherited this massive task of keeping reconciliation at the forefront of Australia's national agenda.
So they needed to find a way
Right.
to translate those big reconciliation goals into tangible actions.
That's it. Yeah, concrete actions.
And let's be honest, a program that would help them secure funding
Yeah, you need funding to make things happen.
to keep the work going, right?
Sure.
And that's where the RAP program comes in.
Exactly.
And the timing of its launch, 2006, seems very deliberate.
It was absolutely strategic.
Yeah.
They timed it to coincide with the 40th anniversary of the 1967 referendum.
Okay. Refresh my memory about the 67 referendum.
Sure. So this referendum,
Huge moment in Australian history.
it was a landmark moment. Yeah.
Yeah.
Australians voted overwhelmingly to include Indigenous peoples in the census
Okay.
and to give the federal government the power to create laws specifically for them.
I see. So by launching the RAP program during this anniversary,
Right.
RA was tapping into this wave of, I don't know, national pride, I guess.
Yeah, a sense of progress.
Progress on Indigenous rights. Very smart.
Definitely.
So break it down for me. What exactly does a RAP entail for an organization? What do they have to do?
Well, imagine it as a roadmap.
Okay.
A roadmap guiding organizations, businesses, government agencies, even sports teams.
Okay.
And it outlines the specific actions they will take to contribute to reconciliation.
So it's taking that broad concept of reconciliation and making it actionable.
Yes, breaking it down into manageable steps.
So instead of just talking about reconciliation,
Right.
organizations are actually putting pen to paper,
Putting their intentions into action.
committing to real change.
Exactly.
So what kind of actions are we talking about?
Well, it could be things like increasing Indigenous employment,
Okay.
providing cultural awareness training,
Got it.
or even something as simple as displaying the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags.
Right, showing those symbols of recognition and respect.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm guessing it's got to be more than just ticking boxes, right?
You're absolutely right. It's not a PR stunt.
Yeah, it can't just be superficial.
No, it's about genuine commitment. And what makes RAPs interesting
Okay.
is that they're built on these three core pillars:
3 pillars. Okay, lay them on me.
respect, relationships, and opportunities.
Okay, now we're getting to the heart of it.
Yeah, this is the good stuff.
So unpack these pillars for me.
Okay, so respect.
Yeah. What does respect look like in action?
It's about genuinely valuing Indigenous culture, their knowledge, their leadership. So, for example, it could mean consulting with Indigenous communities on projects that affect them,
Got it.
making sure their perspectives are included in decision-making,
Yeah.
basically ensuring Indigenous voices are heard and respected within the workplace.
So shifting those power dynamics,
Exactly.
making space for Indigenous leadership, I like it.
And then there's relationships.
All right, so how does that pillar play out?
This one focuses on building genuine connections between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians,
Mm-hmm.
breaking down those barriers that have historically kept communities apart.
Okay.
So it could involve things like cultural awareness training for all staff,
Yeah, makes sense.
or creating partnerships with Indigenous community organizations.
Building bridges.
Exactly. Creating opportunities for people to connect and learn from one another.
And finally, opportunities. What does that encompass?
This pillar is about creating a level playing field
Okay.
and giving Indigenous Australians real pathways to thrive in all areas of life.
So concrete actions to address those inequalities.
Yeah, things like supporting Indigenous businesses,
Really?
providing scholarships, mentoring programs,
Mm-hmm.
anything that helps close the gap in areas like health, education, economic well-being.
So RA really seemed to know what they were doing when they designed this program.
They did their homework.
Yeah, tying it to a historical moment like the '67 referendum.
Yeah, gave it legitimacy.
Yeah, built-in support and then structuring it around these three pillars.
It's smart structure.
Yeah, captures the complexity of reconciliation.
And the numbers reflect that, over 1,000 organizations have joined the program since it launched.
Wow, that's impressive.
But like any ambitious endeavor,
Sure.
it hasn't been without its challenges.
Oh, I'm sure. So what are some of the hurdles the RIP program has faced?
Well, one of the biggest ones has been keeping organizations engaged over the long term.
Okay, keeping that momentum going, I guess.
Yeah, because it's easy to get caught up in the excitement of launching a RAP.
Right.
You have the ceremony, the announcements.
Everyone's feeling good.
Exactly. But the real work comes afterward.
Yeah, the sustained commitment, the day-to-day grind of making those changes.
Exactly. And sadly, not every organization has managed to keep up that commitment.
Meaning they put out their RAP and then went silent.
You got it.
Wow, that's kind of disappointing.
It is, and the research actually shows this. Yeah, a worrying number of organizations didn't follow through on their reporting requirements.
Oh, so they weren't even tracking their progress.
No, and they didn't update their RAPs regularly.
So they treated it as a one-off project.
Instead of an ongoing process.
Which really misses the point of the whole thing, doesn't it?
It does raise some serious questions about whether they were truly committed to reconciliation.
Right. If they're not continuously reflecting, adapting, pushing themselves to do better,
Yeah.
then it becomes more about checking a box.
Than driving real change.
And that doesn't really move the needle on reconciliation, does it?
Not at all.
It also makes me wonder, about how evenly the program's been adopted
Interesting.
across Australia.
Yeah.
I mean, are there reasons why some areas might have embraced RAPs more than others?
Yeah, you've hit on another interesting finding.
Okay.
While we see a good mix of organizations joining the program,
Businesses, you said.
businesses, government agencies,
Not-for-profits.
not-for-profits, the whole spectrum, but the geographic spread is uneven.
Really? Like, can you give me an example?
Sure. So if you look at state-level government organizations,
Okay.
a big chunk of those with RAPs
Yeah.
are in Western Australia.
Interesting.
But then some of the most populated states
Mhm.
have relatively few state government organizations on board.
Huh.
And then surprisingly, the Northern Territory,
Yeah.
which has a large Indigenous population,
All right.
has none.
That's unexpected.
It is, and it points to the fact that
Yeah?
there are probably some state-specific factors at play.
Okay, so things like,
Well, the political climate, for one,
all right, that makes sense.
the influence of local Indigenous organizations,
Mhm.
and even just the historical relationship between Indigenous communities and the government.
Yeah, all that baggage.
Exactly. All that history, it all likely plays a role in how a state approaches RAPs.
So it kind of highlights that a one-size-fits-all approach probably isn't going to work.
You got it.
In a country as diverse as Australia,
Right. You really need to understand those local dynamics.
because what works in one state or region
Yeah.
might not be effective somewhere else.
Exactly. And that sensitivity to local context,
Yeah.
it's crucial if you want your reconciliation efforts to actually mean something.
Thinking back to those organizations that published a RAP and then went silent,
Right.
I wonder if maybe the initial structure of the program itself played a role in that.
You might be onto something.
Yeah.
At first, organizations were expected to report on their progress
Okay.
and then refresh their RAPs
Annually.
every year.
That's a pretty demanding pace, isn't it?
It is, especially for organizations with limited resources.
Yeah.
Or those who are just starting out on their reconciliation journey.
Right, they're still trying to figure things out.
Exactly.
It does sound like a lot to keep up with.
Especially if reconciliation isn't their primary focus.
Right, they have other things on their plate.
Exactly, and the data shows that.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of organizations just couldn't maintain that yearly reporting
And updating.
and updating. It was too much.
So they did the one RIP and then
They kind of fell off the radar.
that's a real shame because if they're not revisiting those RIPs, updating them,
Right.
it becomes more about, checking a box.
Yeah, a symbolic gesture.
Yeah, and less about genuine commitment.
Right, because reconciliation shouldn't be a one-time project.
It's a journey, right?
It is an ongoing process.
You're constantly learning, adapting.
Exactly. And it seems that RA recognized this challenge too.
Really? So they actually made changes to address this issue.
They did.
What did they do?
In 2013, they introduced a new structure, a more flexible approach to RAPs.
2013. Okay. And what was this new structure called?
They called it the RISE structure.
RISE. Okay. What does that stand for?
Reflect, innovate, stretch, and elevate.
Reflect, innovate, stretch, elevate, rise. It's a good acronym.
It is.
So this RISE framework, it kind of guides organizations through the different stages of their reconciliation journey.
Exactly. And each stage has its own requirements and timelines.
So instead of forcing every organization into the same rigid structure,
Right.
it acknowledges that different organizations are going to be at different points.
In their understanding.
Yeah, in their commitment to reconciliation.
Precisely.
So give me an example. How does this work in practice?
Well, like the reflect stage.
Okay.
That's the first one.
Yeah.
And it focuses on just building awareness and understanding within an organization.
So like reconciliation 101.
Yeah, the basics.
Okay.
But then you have the elevate stage.
Okay.
And that's for organizations that have been engaged with indigenous issues for a while.
Ready for the next level.
Exactly. They're ready for those more ambitious reconciliation goals.
So it's kind of like a customized approach to RIPs.
It is, yeah.
Which makes sense.
It does.
Because you don't want to overwhelm organizations that are new to this. And it also helps with that problem of organizations going quiet.
Right. Because it lets them progress at a pace they can sustain.
Sustainable change, that's the key.
It is. And the more advanced RAP types innovate and stretch.
Okay.
Those are designed to last 2 to 3 years.
Oh, so longer timeline.
Longer timelines, yeah, which
Yeah.
gives organizations more time to implement their actions.
Show their commitment.
Exactly.
It seems like RA has really put a lot of thought into making this RAP program as effective as possible.
They've been very responsive to feedback.
Yeah, they're constantly refining it.
But it's important to remember that the program has also had some significant successes.
Okay, I'm curious about that. So what are some examples of where RAPs have actually led to positive change?
Well, for one, it's contributed to increased indigenous employment in some sectors.
That's huge, considering the gap in employment rates
It is a positive step, yeah.
between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians.
Absolutely, but it goes beyond just the numbers.
Okay, how so?
The RAP program has also helped create more culturally inclusive workplaces where Indigenous employees feel valued and respected.
Can you give me an example of what that might look like?
Sure. So some organizations with RAPs have implemented cultural awareness training for all staff.
Yeah.
So everyone understands and respects Indigenous culture and perspectives.
Okay, that makes sense.
Others have created Indigenous employee networks.
Oh, interesting.
These give Indigenous staff a dedicated space to connect and advocate for their needs.
So it's not just about getting Indigenous people through the door.
Right.
It's about making sure they feel supported and included.
Exactly, creating an environment where they can thrive.
And that's a critical part of reconciliation, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Because it's not just about addressing economic or social inequalities. It's about creating a society where Indigenous Australians feel a sense of belonging.
And can participate fully in all aspects of life.
That's the ultimate goal.
It is, yeah.
So it sounds like the RAP program has real potential
It does.
to create positive change.
It does.
But it's not a magic solution, right?
It's not a cure-all, no.
Reconciliation requires a much broader approach.
It's a multifaceted approach.
And we still have a long way to go in Australia.
We do. The RAP program is a valuable tool,
Yeah.
but it's just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
We need to keep pushing for systemic change.
Absolutely.
Addressing those root causes of inequality.
And making sure that Indigenous voices are at the center of decision-making.
It seems like the program's done a pretty good job of balancing practical action with those symbolic gestures.
It has. The creators were very deliberate about that.
So how did they achieve that balance?
Well, remember those 3 pillars of RAPs: respect, relationships, and opportunities.
Yeah.
They actually encompass both practical actions
Okay.
aimed at addressing inequalities and symbolic gestures that promote cultural understanding and respect.
Okay, can you give me some specific examples of how that plays out?
Sure, so let's take the respect pillar. A practical action might be an organization setting targets for procuring goods and services
Yeah.
from Indigenous-owned businesses.
Okay, supporting Indigenous businesses, that's concrete.
It is, but then a symbolic gesture might be acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land.
Okay, at the start of meetings?
At meetings, events.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Right. So you see,
Those actions have their place.
exactly, the practical ones
Yeah.
contribute to real, tangible improvements in the lives of Indigenous Australians,
Mm-hmm.
while those symbolic gestures demonstrate a commitment to valuing their culture and perspectives.
So it's about addressing both the tangible inequalities
Yeah.
and the need for cultural understanding.
It's about addressing both the head and the heart.
I like that, the head and the heart.
That's what makes it powerful.
The RAP program recognizes that reconciliation isn't just about economic progress,
Or social progress.
but also about healing those historical wounds
Over relationships.
and fostering a sense of shared identity.
Exactly.
It's a complex journey. It requires a commitment from all of us in Australian society.
It does, and it's really encouraging to see how the RAP program has become more inclusive
Yeah.
and responsive to the needs of different organizations.
And that evolution is continuing, right?
Oh.
As we learn more
Absolutely.
about what works and what doesn't.
It's an ongoing process of adaptation.
The program can keep getting better.
Exactly. Because reconciliation isn't a static concept.
It's dynamic.
It's dynamic. It requires constant reflection, learning, growth from all of us.
And speaking of evolution, as we've been talking about the RAPA program,
Mm-hmm.
it struck me that the program itself is kind of a product of its time.
Oh, interesting.
Specifically, that era of practical
That's a
reconciliation
good point.
in Australia.
Yeah, you're right. The RAP program really came about during John Howard's time as Prime Minister.
Right, when he was championing practical reconciliation.
Exactly. And his approach really focused on tackling Indigenous disadvantage
Mm-hmm.
through measurable outcomes.
So less emphasis on things like treaty or land rights.
Yeah, he saw those as more symbolic gestures.
Okay.
His focus was on practical action.
And the RAP program, with its focus on setting targets and measuring those outcomes,
It fit right in with that framework.
it did. But it's interesting that it didn't abandon the symbolic aspects entirely.
Right. It wasn't a complete either situation.
So they managed to weave in both.
They did. Yeah, they found a way to integrate those symbolic elements.
Things like you were saying earlier.
Cultural awareness training,
Yeah.
acknowledging traditional owners,
Consulting with Indigenous communities.
all of that, but they framed them within a structure of measurable actions and outcomes.
So they took those symbolic gestures and made them practical
You could say that, yeah.
by making them quantifiable.
Exactly. And it was a smart move.
Yeah, it broadened the appeal of the program.
It did.
It made it attractive to a wider range of organizations
Absolutely.
because it addressed the concerns of those who wanted to see tangible results.
Yeah, hard beta.
Hard da-
But it also acknowledged the importance of cultural understanding and respect.
It's like they were walking a tightrope,
Good work.
trying to appeal to all these different perspectives.
It was a delicate balancing act,
on reconciliation.
but I think they pulled it off.
Yeah, they did.
They created a program that was both pragmatic and principled.
And I think that's a big reason why it's been so successful.
I agree.
And, I can't help but notice the connection between the RAP program and the Close the Gap campaign,
Oh, yeah.
which was gaining a lot of traction around the same time.
Right. Both emerged in that same era of practical reconciliation.
And they both seem to tap into that same energy.
Absolutely.
So Close the Gap campaign, with its focus on closing the gap
Right.
and
Yeah.
life expectancy
Mhm.
and those other key indicators,
Education, employment.
it really resonated with that idea of practical action.
It did. Yeah.
And the RAP programs seem to piggyback on that momentum.
Absolutely. Even the first RAP publication
Yeah.
highlighted the life expectancy gap.
As a key measure of progress.
Exactly. They were saying, we'll know we've achieved reconciliation when we see those gaps disappear.
And that's such a powerful message.
It is.
Because it connects this abstract concept of reconciliation
Right.
to a very concrete, measurable goal.
That everyone can understand.
And it's a goal that ties directly back to the RAP program's core values.
We got it.
Respect, relationships, opportunities.
Because closing those gaps requires us to address systemic inequalities
Build those stronger relationships.
and create real opportunities for Indigenous Australians to thrive.
It all comes full circle.
It does, and the RAP program recognizes that interconnectedness.
It's not about picking and choosing a few actions to tick off a list.
No.
It's about a holistic approach
Exactly.
that tackles those underlying causes
Of inequality.
and promotes a real shift in attitudes and behaviors.
That's what real reconciliation is about.
We've covered a lot of ground today,
We have.
exploring the history, the evolution, the impact, the politics of the RAP program.
It's been a fascinating discussion.
It has. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious to hear your final thoughts.
Well, I think it's clear that the RAP program has made a significant contribution to reconciliation in Australia.
It's brought the conversation into workplaces, boardrooms, communities,
All across the country.
It's encouraged organizations to take action and measure their progress.
But as we've said, it's not a magic solution.
No, reconciliation is an ongoing journey.
Exactly.
And the RAP program is just one tool.
A valuable tool, but still just one tool.
We've got a lot of work ahead of us
We do.
to address those systemic inequalities and historical injustices.
That continue to affect Indigenous Australians.
So where do we go from here? What does the future of reconciliation in Australia look like?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
And it's a question for all of us, organizations, individuals.
What role can we play in shaping that future?
We don't have all the answers,
No.
but hopefully this deep dive has given you a better understanding of the journey so far.
It has, and maybe sparked some ideas for the path ahead.
I hope so.
It's a complex issue,
It is.
but you've done a great job of highlighting the progress that's been made
Thank you.
and the challenges that remain.
It's been a great conversation.
Thank you for sharing your expertise with us today.
It's been my pleasure.
It's interesting, as we've been talking about the RAP program and how it's evolved over time,
Yeah.
I keep coming back to the idea that it's really a product of its time.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, that era of practical reconciliation in Australia,
That's a good point, yeah.
it seems like the program was shaped by that political climate.
It definitely emerged during that period, you're right.
When John Howard was prime minister.
Yeah, John Howard, he was really the champion of that whole practical reconciliation approach.
And his focus was on tackling Indigenous disadvantage through, concrete, measurable actions.
Right, measurable outcomes, hard data.
Exactly. And kind of moving away from those broader discussions about things like treaty or land rights.
Which he saw as more symbolic gestures.
And the RAP program, with its emphasis on setting targets and tracking progress.
It fit perfectly into that framework.
It really did. But it's interesting to me that the program didn't completely abandon those symbolic aspects.
Yeah, it didn't just throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Right. It wasn't just all about the numbers.
No, they found a way to integrate those symbolic elements.
Like we talked about earlier, the cultural awareness training.
Yeah, acknowledging traditional honors.
Consulting with Indigenous communities.
All of that. But they framed it within a structure that allowed for tangible results.
So they took those symbolic gestures and gave them a practical dimension.
By making them measurable, yeah.
It's almost like they figured out how to quantify those gestures.
It was a clever strategy, and I think it really broadened the appeal of the program.
Because it addressed the concerns of people who wanted to see concrete evidence of progress.
Right, they wanted to see results.
But it also acknowledged the importance of those less tangible aspects of reconciliation.
Like cultural understanding and respect.
It's like they were walking a tightrope, trying to balance those different perspectives.
They were navigating a complex political landscape, that's for sure.
But I think they did it effectively. They created a program that was both pragmatic and principled.
And I think that's a big part of why the program has had such staying power.
And it's interesting, too, how the RAP program emerged alongside the Close the Gap campaign.
Yes, the Close the Gap campaign.
Which was really gaining momentum around the same time.
Right, both of them were kind of tapping into that same energy of practical reconciliation.
So the Close the Gap campaign, with its focus on closing the gap in life expectancy and other key indicators.
Yeah, education, employment, all those areas where there's a disparity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians.
It really resonated with that idea of taking action and making a measurable difference.
And the REP program seemed to draw strength from that movement.
It's like they were feeding off each other.
In a way, yeah.
And even that very first RAP publication, if I remember correctly, it highlighted the life expectancy gap as a key measure of progress toward reconciliation.
That's right. They were essentially saying, if we're serious about reconciliation, we need to see these gaps close.
And that's a powerful message because it takes this abstract concept of reconciliation,
which can be hard to define sometimes.
Exactly, and it links it to a very concrete, tangible goal.
A goal that everyone can understand.
And that goal really ties back to the core values of the RAP program, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. Respect, relationships, and opportunities.
Because closing those gaps requires us to address the underlying systemic inequalities.
To build stronger relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians.
And to create real opportunities for Indigenous people to thrive.
It all comes full circle.
It really does. And I think that's one of the most remarkable things about the RAP program.
What do you mean?
It recognizes that interconnectedness. You know, it's not about picking and choosing a few actions to check off a list.
Right, it's not about ticking boxes.
It's about a more holistic approach.
That tackles those root causes of inequality.
And ultimately promotes a fundamental shift in attitudes and behaviors.
That's what real reconciliation is all about.
We've covered a lot of ground today, exploring the history, the evolution, the impact of the RAP program.
We've even delved into the political landscape that shaped its emergence.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with a sense of, I don't know, cautious optimism, maybe?
I think that's fair.
I mean, it's clear that the RAP program has made a significant contribution to the reconciliation journey in Australia.
It's brought the conversation into workplaces, boardrooms, communities across the country.
It's encouraged organizations to move beyond words and take concrete action.
And to hold themselves accountable for their progress.
But as we've discussed, it's not a perfect solution.
No. Reconciliation is an ongoing process, a journey that requires continuous effort and commitment.
And the RAP program is just one tool, albeit a very valuable one, in our collective toolkit.
We still have a lot of work to do to address those deep-seated inequalities.
And to heal the wounds of the past.
Absolutely. That work continues.
So as we leave our listeners with this final thought, I guess the question is, what does the future of reconciliation in Australia look like?
And what role can each of us play in shaping that future?
Because it's not just up to organizations, it's up to all of us as individuals to contribute to this journey.
I think this deep dive has hopefully given everyone a better understanding of where we've come from.
And maybe spark some ideas about where we might go next.
Because the path forward requires a commitment to listening, learning, and working together.
To create a more just and equitable future for all Australians.
That's the ultimate goal.
It's been a fascinating exploration of a complex issue, and I want to thank you for sharing your expertise and insights with us today.
It's been my pleasure. I've really enjoyed this conversation.